Hello and welcome to Let's Talk Leadership Live on what in the UK is a bright, sunny, frosty morning. Joining us today is Tim Hill, who we've had on these conversations before, who's joining us from Germany. Hi, Tim.
Hi there.
And, dear friends, Anne and Brit.
Morning, everyone.
Brit's still in the UK, but we might get to talk about where she's moving to shortly. And Anne, as you know, lives in West London. So it's super to see everyone this morning. And what we're going to be talking about, and we've been all of us have been involved in this for a considerable period of time, is change and change transformation in particular. Because we all recognize that we were chatting before this conversation that actually over the last 12 months and probably a lot longer, all sorts of change has been going on. So we just thought we'd share our thoughts and ideas with you this morning. As usual, if you want to challenge what we're talking about, if you want to ask any questions, just look at the chat line on YouTube and we'll do our best to answer them. So Brit and Tim, great to see you all again this morning. So who wants to kick off with change transformation? Who wants to sort of get the conversation going?
Well, I can start. I can start because one thing that I think is always interesting to talk about is the kind of emotional roller coaster that you go on through change. And we all know that people sometimes resist change. They get kind of stuck at a certain place where they're thinking more about the past. They're perhaps in denial. They're trying to hang on to what they can of the past. And what was interesting for me personally, earlier last year, was that didn't happen so much, or it didn't happen immediately. So I was in the Middle East around February, March, when things were really kicking off on this whole COVID story. And I immediately got the feeling, hey, this is something that's going to go on for years, not necessarily in terms of lockdowns and everything, but the impact, especially the economic impact and so on and so forth. It's going to go on for years. And I found myself actually drifting into a more exploration mode quite quickly. But what I've actually found is that for me, things have slowed down a lot because I've had much less travel and certainly less work, like lots of people. So I've actually found that I've got a feeling of things slowing down rather than speeding up. And I think often we associate change and transformation with dramatic speed and sort of unrelenting pressure. And for me, it's been something almost the opposite. I mean, I think I mentioned before, I've realized that I haven't spent as much time in one place, namely this workroom where I am now, any time in my life. I've never actually spent as long in a single location. So that has advantages, it has disadvantages. But I think in terms of the emotional roller coaster that you normally go through, it's been kind of the opposite of what I would have expected if you talked to me exactly 12 months ago about what was coming. That's an interesting springboard, I think.
Yeah. And it's interesting you say that, because I found I went through the classic sort of, not quite denial, but I don't need to do this. I can sort of avoid it, or I can just sit quietly and, look at the weeds in the garden or whatever it might be. And then I went through a phase in the summer when I thought, no, this is stupid. I've got to accept what's happening, even though fortunately I wasn't impacted directly as a result of any illness or COVID or whatever. And then I found myself going through a period, and I'm still going through it, of saying, I can do it. I don't like doing it. So sort of grudging sort of recognition that you just got to get on with it, because this is the reality. It's not just a blip. And every now and again, sort of moments of thinking, hey, I've done something which I couldn't even thought of doing 12 months ago. I suddenly found I can click a button on a computer and something happens correctly. Whereas if you'd asked me a few months ago, I'd have said, no, that's not something I'm going to be able to do. And also I found that I've been in, and Brit knows this, I've been in moments, and one happened the other day, where I've been working with a client, pressed the wrong button, everything's gone wrong. And I've suddenly gone back into panic mode and now what do I do? And panic mode means let's just press more buttons in the sort of futile hope that it's going to somehow rectify itself. And so it struck me that finally, probably, we're all experiencing for real some of the stuff we've often just talked about
exactly
with our clients as a sort of not an academic exercise, but it's not us being involved in the change, it's working with others involved in change. And that just struck me as a, I thought, actually, I'm now realizing that I'm dealing with this myself.
That's it, Matthew. I was starting off with a physician heal thyself approach. It's kind of how well are we practicing on ourselves, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing too is that I noticed that, on some of the work we've done over the years, I've always been a bit annoyed with organizations using the Kubler-Moss sort of, because it was developed to help people through bereavement and tragic situations. And I thought it's being cobbled by business thought leaders like us and sort of adapted. But actually, I have felt just recently that in the situation we're going through, it's much more Kubler-Ross than it is a business thing. It's deeper than just a job change or a move to a different location because your work has changed or a different team you're working with. It is fundamentally hitting some deep emotions.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also it's global. That for me, that has been the sort of the weird realization that there's change, and like you, Tim, I felt that time almost slowed down rather than sped up. But there was definitely an imposed change, not a chosen one, but an imposed, which is also makes a difference, as we know, in coping with change. And for me, the idea that the entire world was being impacted, at least the humans, not the animals, not the insects, at least not at a level that they're conscious of, but everybody being in the same boat to a larger or smaller extent, obviously, because some people have had to cope with far worse than I think we have had in this virtual room. But the thing that the whole world goes through the same thing, the same threat, which is ultimately an existential threat, was at the same time I found fascinating and scary, and well, it will pass. So there's all these different emotions that you have at different times in this cycle, and I still think it's interesting to go through it, but it's also concerning.
I suppose, listening to you all, I think it's a sort of obvious statement, but I think what we are dealing with as well is the sort of difference between change and transformation. The change is our world's become much more scary, and there's threats all around us, and our health in particular is threatened, and that the people that we love and are close to. But actually the transformation is a bit what you're all saying is, are we actually going to behave differently? Are we going to maybe value different things? And what is it they say? You have to practice things at least 21 times before they become second nature to your new habits. And I guess I can only speak for myself, but for a lot of time I thought, well, I'll develop new habits. I won't travel for a while. I won't do this kind of work. But to actually significantly get onto that new level of the Kubler-Ross and end up at a different plane, which is fundamentally different, which takes you from where you were pre-COVID to where we are now, not yet post-COVID. Do you want that? What kind of person are you going to be? What's your identity going to be? What are your behaviors to match that? And who are you going to be in the world? And I think that's fundamentally what I'm facing is like, there's always things to do, and there's some really interesting opportunities, but it really is different from what I was doing before, even though it's a continuation. And being happy and content with that every minute, every day is not the reality. I go forward and then I go back and I go forward again. That's what I've really noticed, that sort of putting that change curve and the change and transformation into action.
Yeah, I mean, and I remember it's a few years ago now because my mother's now 95, but she stopped working full time. I think she was 86 or 87, I can't remember. And she was still then fit and active of an 86-year-old. And I remember having a conversation with her in her kitchen a few months after she'd sort of physically retired. And she said she was hating it because she was no longer the person that she had been. That she had spent her life being a person that was recognized for various things that she did, or she had a role, or she had a job, or she contributed in different ways like everyone does. And she said, suddenly I realized I'm sitting here at home at 86. I'm not I don't feel I'm the person that I was. I've lost my identity. And I just wonder whether coming through what we're going through at the moment, people are having to completely reassess who they are and and what they believe in, what their values are, what they'd like to see different, having gone through all this pain and heartache. Really quite much deeper, bigger sort of questions for all of us, perhaps, than just the sort of leadership development. Let's have a look at change and how you lead through it. For me, it just seems much more deeper and more personal. Because picking up on your point, Brit, it's covering, it's everywhere. It's not just something happening to me or to you. Everyone is feeling this in different ways, and many people feeling it far, far worse and much deeper than perhaps we are at the moment.
It's not just we've got 3 big change programs running in our company at the moment. Wow, what stress! It's the whole backdrop to everything as well, and that's really the factor. Yeah.
I mean, I was talking to a client yesterday, and it's incredibly large, successful business. But I just sensed that the people who were all senior were up for a conversation about loneliness. And as soon as I touched on it as being something that we'd noticed, people were sort of saying to us that even though they're in work, maybe they've not even been impacted by the COVID directly, the loneliness of the point you've made, Tim, I've not in a sense left this room, or I've spent more time in this room than I've ever spent in my life. And I just touched on it, and bang, even the most senior executives were saying, yeah, we feel like that, and probably all of our colleagues feel like that, and we need to be focusing on it even more than we are. And you'd never have heard senior execs talking about loneliness and well-being even 12 months, 2 years ago.
And I think that is true for pretty much most people, but we also need to acknowledge that there are people for whom there's no going back from being more at home, being more with their children, not having 2-hour journeys to work, and their home lives, although in many ways being more challenging, particularly with the homeschooling when people have young children or school-age children, but actually the closeness and intimacy is often valued. And also the fact that logistically life is often easier than when they're traveling a lot or either outside the country or within it. So, there's a reality which some people are saying, I don't want to go back to an office even 4 days a week. I actually like working from home. So we're going to need to transform our working practices, I think. And also talking about, senior execs being, as you said, Matthew, very lonely. I think, one of the things I've been struck with in the last 2 or 3 weeks is how many young people who've had their apprentice schemes cut back, who haven't been able to meet people at university. All of the kind of restrictions have meant that some of them are so incredibly lonely and haven't even, emerged out of their young adulthood, the 18-year-olds, a teenhood, if you like, and being able to find themselves. It's by comparing themselves more with other people. And I think that sense of loneliness and not able to establish your identity is huge for young people.
Yeah, and that goes back to what you said, Tim, that this will have ramifications well into the future. Even when we have all been vaccinated and sort of the lockdowns have been lifted and all of that, there will be a hidden cost which will span a long time, I think.
People will talk about pre and post COVID for the foreseeable future, for as long as we are living, and probably the next generations as well, just like they talked about pre and post war, hopefully without quite the impact of a world war, but it will become part of the language that people use, without any doubt.
Well, certainly. I mean, Joe Biden mentioned in one of his speeches yesterday, that 400,000 people had died in the United States from COVID, and he linked it straight back to the Second World War and said that more people have died of COVID in the States than died in the whole of the Second World War, fighting for the American forces. That connection's already, that scale is already being linked.
And there was another article, I think the other day in the paper, that said that in wartime, at least what people were able to do, and you saw that happening, is that they would come together and they would organize things together, or get supplies from A to B, or even shelter together. There was no need to do any social distancing, so people could derive some comfort from being physically with other groups of people doing something, whereas this is like a very cruel sort of, the one thing that we need most, which is human contact, is the one thing that can make us ill and possibly cost our life. So,
and I think we do have to remember, building on Anne's point, that there are enormous numbers of people who are still commuting who do need to be physically present. I mean, as my dentist said to me, don't talk to me about working from home. And then his assistant kind of turned around from behind the mask as well and went, like that. So I think sometimes that we have to remember it's not the whole world who's working from home. There's a lot of people who need to go to work for obvious reasons. But there's also a lot of businesses that are absolutely booming out of this and having perhaps the more conventional stress of too much to do and not enough people, for example. And I think as leadership developers, we also need to keep that in balance as well. So it's a little bit like Anne said, but thinking a little bit wider about what type of work people are doing, which businesses are actually successful out of this, because it's not necessarily a Great Depression for all businesses, without any doubt.
And I've had conversations again, in the last few days with one or two people in terms of doing some discovery work for some stuff I'm doing. And one or two of them have said, we've realized we've got to stop putting the pressure on people. This issue about we've got lots of work. I mean, this particular client has got a lot of work on. We've got to stop putting pressure on our colleagues. And we've also got to start thinking, what do we stop doing? We cannot continue at the most awful level, seeing the Royal London Hospital on the news every night, being absolutely overwhelmed, and highly trained nursing staff, doctors, cleaners, care workers, almost in floods of tears under the pressure, and somehow managing to cope. But a recognition, stepping back from what is that is at a completely different plane, but stepping back into some of the businesses that are saying, yes, our lives are booming, but we're just piling pressure and pressure and pressure on people who are isolated, and something has got to give, and a recognition that actually we've got to start having conversations around, do we need to be doing all of this? What do we stop doing? And unlike in seemingly in the health service, where they've had to make some tragic decisions about, well, if we're going to do this, we physically cannot do, more mundane operations, so we're going to have to delay all of those. I'm not getting that in business sense yet. I'm still finding I'm meeting clients who are saying, oh yeah, well, it's booming and we're just really going at it, without seeing that actually just the same sort of, perhaps at a different level, the same stresses are starting to appear in individuals working on their own, struggling to sort of do all of this extra stuff, as well as looking after children, caring for the elderly, doing all the other things that they're involved with. I think that change, what we're going through is not going to go away, but we really do fundamentally have to deal with, if we're going to move into, I think some people call it the hybrid world, if we're going to move into a place where we've still got to take the pressure off. If all we learned from the pandemic is that for years we've been pushing and pushing and pushing, and all we've gone for is bottom line stuff, bigger companies, bigger turnovers, bigger profits, richer people getting richer and richer and richer, and a lot of other people getting poorer and poorer and poorer. That has to change. That fundamental thing has to change for good. Otherwise, we're just going to implode. I think seeing what's happening in the health service should be a warning for everyone around the world that we have fundamentally got to change the way we do things.
And just, I suppose, a word on, I think we're talking about change at different levels, aren't we? We're talking about leadership development, and as us doing the work of developing people in groups, in teams, at societal level. Hopefully, if our impact really stretches out in terms of what people can then, the change they can leverage. And I was thinking also how important the work is at individual levels to help people think back over to what's happened to them. And it's going to be very personal. So there are all these themes that we can all relate to. And then I think it's about what touches the individual, you know, how their values been affected, what brought them joy in 2020. What is it that they made a change about that was really positive and they don't want to go back to the old world? And what is something that they had to take up on, you know, in 2020 that they don't want to continue. They have to do it pragmatically. And so I think, you know, one of the roles that we can really help people with is to consolidate their learning and to take that through that loop of learning and think, it was horrendous, and let me not just rush forward and think, thank God it's over. But what have I really learned, and what do I know about myself and the world, and what I want my contribution to be, and what can I do about that? And I think there are a number of tools that we have as well that can help people in a sort of systematic way to make sense of their experience and take them forward.
Yeah, maybe we're able to explore some of those.
Yes, well, one of the tools that we've used on some of our leadership programs with senior leaders, but really it works at any level, is something called an immunity map, and some of our readers may already have used it. It was devised by two researchers from Harvard, Keegan and Leahy, who've done some really super work on resilience and development and how you tie the two together. And we're thinking maybe we will do a working seminar to take people through this. You gain a lot from it personally, but actually if you can work with a group of people and they work as pairs, so they do some of the work individually to think about what their goal is for change, and then they've got a trusted peer that they can work alongside and talk it through and have a sounding board for. This is something actually, not all things that we do translate well into virtual world, but this sort of systematically working through what's my goal, what's keeping me where I am, what behaviors do I continue with that I ought to let go of, why do I continue with those? There's something competing in me, and you know, what assumptions am I making about myself and the world, and taking yourself forward and really acknowledging, gosh, this is me and this is legitimate what I'm thinking and feeling, but I do want to do something different, and how do I do that? So this is a tool that we're thinking about sharing more widely with you. So please watch this space.
And Anne, you touched on a point, I know several weeks ago now, this thing about you need to give up something to create space for something new.
Yes.
And that, I don't know why I keep coming back to that. It keeps resonating with me. But you know, that whole sort of mental internalization sort of thought process that says, actually, out of all of this, I could do some stuff I'd perhaps always wanted to do, or I've discovered an interest in something, or a way of doing something, or a way of living or being that I've just never given any thought to, or any time to. And maybe now's the time, you know, to think about, right, I've decided I'm gonna stop doing that to create space for doing something new.
This is the U curve for change. Yeah. And it's so visual, it's lovely. It has the U curve. It's a little bit like, obviously, you know, change is change, and we've got the Kubler-Ross curve. So it looks quite similar, but I think that wording, let go. So as you're going down the curve and getting used to the change, you're thinking, what am I letting go of? Things that I value, but things that I also maybe don't value. And you get to the bottom where you're thinking, here I am, this is me. But actually there is some light at the end of the tunnel, and that's where you think about what you're going to come up the curve and what is it you're taking on.
Yeah, and I think that gives a feeling of having a bit more power over the situation again, not complete power, but taking some initiative and taking some control back is actually very, very illuminating and very positive for people. Because I mean, often that curve that Anne's describing, we've all been talking about, is a feeling of complete powerlessness, and that's just a way of just getting a bit more control back into the situation. Yeah.
Yes, even though it might not have been something you'd have chosen, but you can make it your own. I think that's very important, Tim. That's good that you've said that. Because I think that gives hope to people as well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And they feel heard at an individual level.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think it's also something around, again, a comment you made, Tim, about, you know, I haven't done any traveling, or I was in the Middle East. Yeah. And all of us on this screen would at this time of the year be jumping on and off planes, you know, and we forget how privileged that is. You know, one of the things that this has made me realize is that I'm hugely privileged to have been doing what I've been doing for the last 20, 30 years. But as that was the norm, one didn't spend much time thinking about it other than thinking, oh, this is rather fun. I'm in Munich this week, or I'm in the States another week, and I'm seeing something I perhaps wouldn't have seen if I wouldn't have been able to afford to see if I'd tried to do it on holiday. But then after a while, actually, I found I don't know that I'm missing it as much as I would have. If you'd asked me back in June, I'd have been biting my nails saying, oh, am I ever going to get back to X or Y? But actually, the travel thing, I've just said, actually, it's created space for other things. And going back to the point you made, Anne, about, the change is permanent. I've heard people say, I'm really enjoying taking my daughter to school. I would never be able to do that. And in fact, whatever happens, I want to continue to do that. Making space. I'm not in a car for 3 hours every day on a commute. I'm not sitting knee to knee on the 1014 or whatever it is from Brighton to London 3 times a week to do something. It's changed, and I'm not going to go back. But I needed a bit of time, which I think is true of all transformation. I needed a bit of time to just get realizing what was important to me, and actually the bit I thought I was going to miss, with time, I get used to it. And in fact, I suppose it's a bit like, I don't want to make it too serious, it's a bit like bereavement. You get to a point where you get past that awful gut-wrenching feeling of missing someone, and you start to reflect on all the lovely things that happened while they were alive, or while they were well, or whatever. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't mean you get over it, but it helps you move into a place where you think, actually, the reality of this is I've got to make space for things that are important. I've got to move on. And I suppose at a leadership level, it's helping people do that. Your point, Anne, do it individually. I think it's going to become a bigger part of what we talk about, and a bigger part of what we do, helping people through that process.
And I think in terms of the idea of a U shape, there are times that you're falling back down the U, a bit like a ball bearing doing this. And I think as leadership developers or as leaders, you've got to be aware that that's going to happen. Some people are going to have some very bad days, weeks, maybe months, even though they seem to be getting into the so-called new normal. And leaders have to be not just tolerant of that amongst their people, but also really, really work with it, because there will be times where you're thinking, I thought we'd established this. We're working in a new way now. Why are people complaining again? I thought we dealt with the loneliness issue, whatever it happens to be. But a part of the curve is that it's not a smooth movement. There's going to be bad times as well as you're drifting back.
The realization that is actually normal and necessary, and therefore okay.
Yes.
Okay to not be okay.
Yeah. And a technocratic leader is one who might say, we've been through that phase, what is your problem? And obviously that's not very helpful of moving into the mid-21st century, that kind of approach.
And a phrase that keeps cropping up in some of the conversations I've been having, and it wasn't my, I think it's an excellent thought, it's not mine at all, is the term checking in or checking up. I've pinched it from the person who said it, and I'm using it a lot in conversations now, with people. Are you think about why you're contacting that person. Are you contacting them because you genuinely want to find out how they are? And I'm talking about a work situation, and perhaps you're leading a team of people that are now virtual. Are you checking in with them because you genuinely want to find out how they are? Or are you actually sneakily checking up on them to make sure that they're doing what you hope they're doing? And it's interesting how many people actually, when they sit and they honestly reflect on it, say, yeah, actually, I've probably come across as someone who checks up all the time. And I need to give some thought to how I connect. So although I'm doing that, I'm also genuinely checking in with them to make sure they're okay. And do they need some support or help? And I don't know whether you've noticed it, but we found at a social level, we speak to people less. That's really almost since Christmas, that's gone very quiet. The calls the telephone calls you get, or the fact you might bump into a friend in the local town while you're doing some shopping and catch up with them. That's not happening. That's all gone. That's a change that's happening. But it's, yeah, interesting. It's interesting stuff. Any other thoughts about it?
Yeah, building on that, Matthew, I was just thinking it's the accidental and incidental meetings with people and exchanges of information that have gone, because of course you might also spend more time talking to people via Zoom than you would have done before, or perhaps exchanging in another way. That's perfectly possible that you see more, at least on the screen, of certain people, but it's these casual interactions. And, you know, I mean, research on knowledge management shows that that's often the so-called tacit knowledge, where things are passed on and where things are, let's say, retained by an organization. When I say things, I'm talking about the knowledge of how to do things particularly. And when that's gone, I think it's interesting to think about the long-term impact of that, because I think we all know situations when we've worked in a company where you bump into someone in a corridor and you hear far more in those 2 minutes that you're walking down the corridor with someone than you would have done in hours and hours of meetings, whether those meetings were virtual or live, whatever. And those kind of, as I say, incidental, accidental meetings, how that kind of tacit knowledge and interaction gets replaced is a real question long term.
You know what, that before you said that, Tim, I think what I had in mind, but I didn't know how to make the links. I'm interested what the rest of you think, is something about co-creation, also about professional intimacy. You know, how can we have enough of that virtually? Are we creating enough relationships where people really can create things together, or is there something about not being physically with people? You know, those little conversations that you have that means that you're just not building the relationship in a way that potentially you build the trust and have more disclosure, which is, I guess, the professional intimacy that maybe is really an important condition of creating things together, getting more than we would do individually by working away at our desks. I wonder if that's something. I think people are missing those connections with people, but also what are we missing in industry and in business and organizations in terms of that chilling out together?
And some of our clients, and I know, Matthew, you and I have worked with a couple of people who've done that. They have tried to formalize the informal in order to replace the sort of the coffee machine chit chat that has now gone, which is more than just chit chat, actually, like you said, Tim.
Yeah.
But it's also difficult because some of those people have told us that, well, we're in Zoom meetings virtually every day, all day almost, some of us, and then to have an informal Zoom meeting on Friday afternoon to replace the Friday afternoon drinks, I'm just not up for it. You know, a lot of people are just, they get Zoom fatigue, and so it is much harder to stage that informality for a lot.
Yeah, exactly, Brit. And I think that would also confuse the social side, which is important, the relationship building and maintenance side, with something that is much more, well, I won't necessarily say more important, but something that's actually much more business focused, which is like, as I say, this transfer of knowledge, however we're describing knowledge. It's not just database knowledge, it's knowledge, as I said earlier, about how to do things, who to contact, what mood so-and-so is in, these kind of things. And that's like the oil that keeps human life together a lot of the time. Sometimes it's called gossip, yes, and sometimes it is gossip. Part of that is gossip, but it's not only that.
Jokes, or you know, all these sort of the more light-hearted side of business, which are actually very important.
Yeah,
which in itself creates the part of the culture of the organization.
Yeah.
It leads to issues around how do you onboard people. You know, so there are companies, I mean, the one I was speaking to yesterday is recruiting about 40 people at the moment. How do you onboard them, or how, I perhaps don't like that word, it sounds a bit too nautical, but you know, how do you help them into their new role in a new company with new people? How do you manage that change for them? How do you look at it from their perspective and thinking, well, this is not just about sitting them down with the HR department on a Monday morning and going through 2 hours of contractual stuff and then going to see their future boss. all of it's got to be done differently because it's virtual. So how do you help them through that change when they haven't got even someone that might smile at them in the office and say, oh, hi, you new, and let's have a coffee and we'll get to know each other. None of that, all of that's gone.
Yeah.
How do you help people through that change process? I mean, that's just one example that seems to crop up. We've talked about helping people working at home, dealing with isolation, maybe finding time to look after children, things. But people who join organizations, or helping people to leave organizations, how do you manage that? Because often when people retire, they move into a world where there is some connection with what they've been doing in the past. They meet one or two ex-colleagues. Or maybe when people move to another job in another organization, there is still some contact face to face. They meet up with old colleagues. All of that's changed. Everything that we hold as being the way we would normally do things has become very different, and it's likely to stay so. So we've got to start really thinking about how we, as people who help leaders at all levels, how we help them in those particular practical realities. Just going back to this comment then, Anne, that you made about maybe sort of not just talking about this stuff, but perhaps sharing some things that might be helpful to others. What's your, and I've got the dog barking in the background.
Oh, that's staged, Matthew, because you want to show.
Yeah, Sid the postman is coming with the mail. He's going to get his leg bitten off for the 100th time. So Anne, just describe a little bit about how you think this session might work that we were talking about earlier. And then we'll leave people to think about it. And
yes, absolutely. So I think it needs working up a little bit, but I was thinking that we could have maybe a group of 4 or 5 of us such as this, and one of us could facilitate the model, much as we would do if we were in a room with a group of leaders, managers. And so 2 or 3 of you would work on a change that you've got. And so there are 5 steps to it. And the facilitator, for example, me, would be guiding you through it. And we'd have an even number of participants who bring a change. And then so that they can work individually on their worksheets. And we'll have the worksheet up, we'll show it to you, and find a way that we can share it in real time. And then you can work individually on it. So you have some time to think about what's important to you. And then you have the access of working with someone and talking to them. And we'll find a mechanism where maybe we'll put you in breakout rooms. We'll find a way where you can have those private conversations and then bring them back, and we'll share what's important, so that people can practically work through something that's bugging them, something that's a change that they really care about, but maybe they haven't yet been able to think about how to do it. And maybe even just putting it off because they know it's a bit of a challenge. And as we were saying, maybe they're going to have to give something up that's made them successful up to this point in time. So there's a lot of reasons why they might not do it, and yet they know they want it. So it'll be a practical session where you work on it individually, you only share what you want. It's a system you go through that's tried and tested based upon psychological research of how change happens. And then you have the chance to dip out and talk with one of your colleagues. And then share. And I think it's a very powerful system. We've worked through it with quite a number of individuals who've been very surprised. And I think what, of course, is so obvious, isn't it, is that it's all your data, and actually you know the answers. Sometimes it's just sitting down with a pen and a paper and a trusted colleague and working through it. So we'd like this to be a really practical, really helpful format for people working through something that's really important to them in terms of a change. And of course, what we could say is that, that is something then that you might want to take back to your workplace. If it's work related, it could also be personal, and or get some mentoring or coaching on, so that, maybe it's something that's in your mind now, but you don't want to talk about it because you haven't got enough detail on it to feel, you feel a bit exposed if you were talking about it. So this will give you a point where you can take it back and either talk about it at home or talk about it at work.
Great. I think that sounds super. So we'll put that in the diary for February. And I don't know how we promote it yet, probably on LinkedIn or Instagram or whatever, but we'll work something up, because I think that would be a really as I think you said earlier before we even started this conversation, it moves a conversation into some practical things that we can help people with.
Yes, and please don't be put off, everyone, by the name immunity to change, because of course we all want immunity at the moment. But actually this is something where your body is creating an immune reaction, which actually is stopping you getting something you want.
Yeah.
So it's the opposite really of the immunization against COVID. You know, you can see how our body does keep us in old patterns or does create an immune reaction. And that's terribly helpful in some situations, and in others, it will stop us getting what we want or we need to be successful in some role in our life.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, on that happy.
Look forward to working with it.
We've probably chatted long enough. Thank you, all of you, Brit and Tim, for joining this conversation. It's always good fun on a Friday morning. And if you have been watching, then I hope you've got something out of it. If you do watch it in the future, because we get a pretty big uptake sort of a week or two after this has been posted, then do get back to us and watch out on our LinkedIn page or on Instagram when we'll set a date for running one of these sort of sessions where Anne takes us through the immunity to change model, but gets us doing some practical work on it, so that it might be of help to people sort of watching this or around the world who are in leadership roles and are struggling a bit at the moment of making sense of their lives. So great to see you all. Take care, and thank you for joining the conversation.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy weekend.
Yeah.